I just wanted to say hello to everyone first. I think the first question is you know, what am I presenting here? So in late December, I started to work on going through official documentation around the U.S. investigations into Manning, Assange, Wikileaks, and the press. I had been in attendance for the first 3 days of the pretrial hearing and had written a handwritten transcript of those 3 days because I felt that, of course, one can report on the proceedings, but I feel that information scales better when you give people source documentation so that other people can also review it. Domain-specific experts on, for example, forensic analysis of digital forensic analysis, or legal experts can look at the procession of search warrants or any kind of legal matter related to Manning's case. So,
thanks, Katie.
So I came home and I felt a tremendous sense of a disappointment in myself for not knowing enough. And there are some great journalists covering. I mean, Madar, for example, Chase Madar has done some fantastic work. There were some great bloggers and journalists covering at the pretrial, but in terms of the mainstream media, there isn't really any kind of serious analysis as to the implications of this particular trial, what kind of precedent it will set, what it tells us about where we are at in our democratic republic. And so I decided to try to find out that information. So I started this timeline, and from now I'm going to switch over to my computer screen now, so I can actually just share this with you. Bear with me 1 second, please. Okay, so here I have my notes. So here's the timeline, and this is the URL. You can find it at. Once I populate it with, it's a work in progress, and I do have quite a bit of data in here, but when I feel like it's ready to, I have the time to do any kind of usability update or to share it in a way that can crowdsource any kind of other work, I'll go ahead and see where it can go. For the time being, since it's got some usability issues, I'm going to go ahead and just go here. So if you look at the timeline, you can see that it spans from the January 26th, 2006. All right, we're stuck in the back. Wikileaks was registered. And all of the timeline entries have, when you click on them, they give you the source documentation. So this isn't just sort of like making this up as I'm going along. I'm trying to really enable journalists and other experts or just concerned citizens to find information as a service to them. I'm sorry, I just hear stuff in the background. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Okay, so how this works. Basically, it starts in 2006, as I said, and it goes through, so far I've gone through the entire congressional record, all of the Defense Department official statements. I have all of the defense data, all of the official documentation that has been released to the public by defense. And the interesting thing is because there is no public information from the prosecution, there is quite a bit of details about the prosecution's case within the defense documentation. I'll give you an example. 1 second, please. I'll get to that in a second. You know what? I want to actually go through this outline so that I don't waste people's time here. So some of the questions that I've had is one of the questions that I think has not been covered at all in the press and is really central to not only the defense of Bradley Manning, but also to the larger implications of what this case will essentially create for our government and for our people. Who is Bradley Manning's chain of command? Those spoke the first night at this particular conference about, I think he was referring to Chase Madar's research on the evidence publicly known in the U.S. government, because they've written reports on it, of abuse by the Iraqi Federal Police for detainees. The incident that shows up in the chat files about Manning having brought this evidence that these several detainees had actually written scholarly work on corruption, what happened to the funds that went all the way up to the Iraqi prime minister, and his command told him, run along now, go find us some more detainees. That's actually found also in defense documentation by another witness other than the chat. So I think the timeline is useful in terms of not only deconstructing the government's case, but also is useful in terms of evaluating how we got here. How did we get to a Bradley Manning? Because Bradley Manning is essentially being scapegoated for this massive leak. Doesn't want to put U.S. government war on terror on trial. So they don't, in the pretrial hearing, you had two of his commands there. Article 31, which is essentially like something similar to invoking, the Fifth Amendment and not wanting to implicate themselves. But really, the chain of command here is really what should be being investigated. Our prompts, number one. Secondly, the miscarriage of command when President Obama, for example, made comment that Bradley Manning was guilty. How our wars are being managed, what policies are with regards to handing people over to torture, outsourcing torture, which we've done with many of our Gitmo detainees. So that's really the crux of something that the government is avoiding. Also, I wanted to know who is investigating and prosecuting Manning, Assange, and WikiLeaks, and how are those cases built, and what individual or institutional forces are at play. And what I've come up with, and I have, there's some overarching themes that I think are central to what citizens, sorry, okay? Are we?
I'm sorry, continue. There's another loud.
Okay. If you look at the screen, this is a developing sort of hunches and analysis. There's so much data. One of them is clearly something that we both know, as citizens, is that the U.S. really has no prior legal constraint against organizations like WikiLeaks. So the government is looking to define or find a way to make WikiLeaks not look like a publishing site because of their, they would have subsequent protection under the First Amendment. The U.S. is also seeking to prosecute Manning and Assange under military law. Of course, the rhetoric was in December 2010 time period, but the Defense Department has the lead in this case. It was their individual, this is their language. If there's a prosecution, it will be DOD-led. The reason why the U.S. government hasn't reached out to WikiLeaks is because to do so would actually jeopardize their case against WikiLeaks. When we look at the institutional machinery that's actually at play here is the DOD and the intelligence sectors are going to try to use this case to make an example out of what they call the culture of disclosure. So this is really fundamental. We need to understand this as a people. The U.S. government is vulnerable to the same tactics they devised in the Department of Defense's 32-page U.S. counterintelligence memo against WikiLeaks, which was produced under the DOD's intelligence code. The agencies won't share info with each other if their architecture is viewed as insecure, right? So the DOD tried to provide a strategy to make WikiLeaks look like it's not trustworthy, it's not secure, and they created an entire media campaign to do that. simply agencies. I'm going to turn off the sound because I hear that guy in the background. It's not simply agencies, it's also nation states. So the exploding scale and scope of the intelligence bureaucracies, it runs parallel to our military's infiltration into every aspect of civil society. So in other work that I've done, I've talked about how in the DoD, their thinking around media and information is they view it as a theater. You can even see Hillary Clinton talking about the information war and how the U.S. is losing the information war. So, crackdown on whistleblowers, this whole crackdown on this, what they call culture of disclosure. You have to remember, these are bloated bureaucracies, so we have hundreds of thousands of people with classification levels in the U.S. It's really actually a policy designed for bureaucrats that has consequences across cities. So central to this West prosecution against Manning and WikiLeaks is really actually this idea that as if he is in fact a whistleblower, his disclosure, and others, because this is a very broad investigation actually, and I'll get to that in a second, is threatening the U.S.'s capacity for war on terror, which by their own words relies on this sort of information sharing environment. It's an abstraction that they've defined, this sort of capacity of and willingness to share information. And what I find most interesting about this particular idea is that it's a complete assertion over the rights of the press and the people in our country. And I'll give you an example. I want you to listen to Mr. Gates in this press conference.
Where sacrosanct principle.
Can you hear?
Start over?
Yeah.
I spent most of my life in the intelligence business. Sacrosanct principle is protecting yourself.
Here, I'm going to start it over.
I spent most of my life where sacrosanct principle protecting your sources.
Can you hear it?
And that involves your sources. Trust me. Protect them. You have to protect their identities. That is one of the worst aspects of this, as far as I'm concerned. Will people trust us? Will people whose lives are on the line trust us to keep their identities secret? Will other governments trust us?
He goes on, I'm going to just sort of the press in this particular, this work in intelligence his entire life. The most sacrosanct idea is protecting one's sources. And then he goes on to say that WikiLeaks doesn't know anything about that. What it is essentially is saying that the intelligence sector's information sharing environment takes precedent over the press's own ability to protect sources. And never once does he mention responsibility to protect its sources. So this is really cutting to the core of our civil liberties in our nation. Do you guys get where I'm going with this? Yeah, make it more elaborate.
Someone asked that you repeat your last statement.
So what I'm saying here is that this intelligence bureaucracy and defense bureaucracies thinking around the information sharing environment is really actually cutting to the core of our civil liberties and the rights of the press. So who has the right to protect sources? Is it the intelligence bureaucracies or is it the press? It's a complete assertion of the executive branch over the rights of the people, the First Amendment right. and the right to protect sources that is pretty much sacrosanct in journalism, which is at the heart of what WikiLeaks does. So they're spinning this in a certain way. Are you guys following me? Yeah. Okay, good. So if you really look at the reality of their statements about this information sharing environment, another way that they talk about it is sources and methods. You know, you'll hear in the mainstream media them talking about that you know, these documents revealed sources and methods, et cetera, et cetera. 1 second, please. I think, 1 second, please. What's also interesting, but before I move on about that, what's also interesting here is the idea that in terms of the press and the intelligence sector, you'll notice that there was a press conference that Morell, the press secretary of the defense, gave, where he demanded that WikiLeaks return this stolen documents. And the journalists, there's technical issues, so I can't show you the video. I will bring it up though, just to have it. Where, you know, as far as the Defense Department is concerned, this was on August 6, 2010. New York Times is a journalism outlet. WikiLeaks is not. And this plenty of returning the copies of the documents. I mean, it's on the internet. It's digital information. It can be multiplied a billion times over. Can you guys hear it when I play videos?
The last one wasn't great. It was choppy. But let's try it and see what happens.
Just said, and it's a technical cyber question, I guess. He said, return to their rightful owners. So, this is these documents belong to the United States government. They don't belong to WikiLeaks. They don't belong to anyone else. My question is right. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I understand. I understand. Are they copies on the internet, or are these documents missing from U.S. military possession? Nothing is missing as far as we can tell. But they do not belong to anyone but us. We want whatever they have returned to us, and we want whatever copies they have expunged, erased, gone. Tony, you're shaking your head.
Not this somewhere, hold up.
Consternation, I don't know that the New York Times or the other companies are presenting the documents. I think they were allowed to review the documents. As my understanding, Tony, I do not believe that they are currently in possession of these documents.
I mean, what this shows is a complete lack of originality. I mean, we know why they're doing it. They're spinning, right? They're spinning. They don't, and I'll show you in a second. They have no case against, Manning and Assange, and in their incompetency, which is evident through the timeline of their investigation. What they did do was to launch essentially a media campaign against WikiLeaks and Assange. And I want to give you some evidence of that, just because, we can talk about that theoretically and such, but let's look at the Pentagon's rape, Twitter rape campaign against Assange, which is, I think the timeline is really interesting. So, I just have to pull this up. So here we are. We're in August, okay? On the 20th of August, basically hell broke loose in Sweden. I mean, you had like a lot of drama going on that day. If you look at the timestamps of the police interviews, and even the timestamp of when Expressen, a Swedish tabloid, leaked to the press the story that Julian Assange was being hunted down as a suspect of rape, it's quite interesting to me that literally within hours, Twitter, all the military channels on Twitter sent out these tweets from the Army Times, etc., basically calling Julian Assange a rapist. My favorite in terms of its seediness is one where they call him a collateral rapist. And the timeline contains, I won't go any further than that, but the timeline does contain all of those tweets in it. So at 6:40 p.m., while Sophia Weiland, one of the women, is being interviewed, right? She hasn't even completed her interview. The warrant has already gone out. And the warrant went out under Anna Arden, who wasn't interviewed until the next day, officially. Also, between 6:40 p.m. and 11:18 p.m., the story was leaked by the prosecutor, by somebody, right, to a Swedish tabloid. It's the kind of manipulation of the media that has really been rampant amongst the Pentagon. And like I said, it's because they don't have a case. So let's talk about that. Firstly, in the pretrial testimony, and I'm going to just switch back to this first. Oh, you see? So in the pretrial testimony, what was revealed on day 2 was that Manning's pretrial confinement, especially at Quantico, right? So this is him having to been forced to strip. What's also revealed from the defense documentation is there's a video of it that they've asked for them to preserve. There's a video of Manning being stripped and interrogated, and the prosecution has delayed the release of that after multiple requests by defense, and that's all in the timeline. But the original agent on the case from Army CID, so this is early on, based Manning's pretrial confinement on 2 things: on a confidential informant, which is Adrian Lamo, right? We know that's Adrian Lamo from and a article in Stars and Stripes magazine called "A Wiki for a World of Secrets." It's a military magazine. And when defense cross-examined her during the pretrial, to try to pick apart the credibility of this affidavit, he noted that her affidavit stated that Manning had been penetrating .mil, which are military websites, and .gov accounts for over a year. And Kempkins pointed out that the affidavit was produced in May of 2010, and that Manning had only been deployed since November of 2009. So how then could Graham be sure that he was penetrating systems for over a year? And what became apparent through the pretrial hearing is that a great deal of incompetency occurred, certainly in the beginning of the investigation, well into November of 2011. A couple weeks after Manning is arrested, you guys can see the timeline right now. I'm gonna actually go back. Let me share this. Okay, so let me go here. A couple weeks. Manning is arrested in Kuwait, May 29th, 2010. Okay. In August of 2010, Neil McBride hires Andrew Peterson. Andrew Peterson is the DOJ's Terrorism and National Security Unit. He is also one of the prosecutors named on the Twitter secret orders. Okay? So essentially, not a couple days later, literally 4 days later, the U.S. files a request for executable delay on Manning's case because they're completely unprepared for it. Also, one second here. wanted to bring up this so you guys know where to find it. So here we are. This is where defense files the preservation. This is the day after. Production of the video of Manning being stripped and interrogated. So on January 18th, defense was notified that this had happened, and the next day they filed the preservation of evidence because everything is videotaped. Other little insights that are, bear with me here. So the hard drives arrived from Iraq on June 10th, 2010. And what also has become clear is that diplomatic security was responsible for assisting Army CID for forensic analysis. One second here. July 29th is a big day. You know, basically let's just look at July. What's going on here? So basically, on the 26th, Wikileaks released the Afghan war logs. Okay? It's clear from the timeline that the DoD had no idea that it was coming. In fact, my suspect that they were actually informed by the New York Times. I'm just looking for them. On the 22nd of July is when the New York Times actually had a meeting with the executive telling them about the Afghan war logs. So up to this point, Army's pretty much handling the investigation. So Wikileaks on the 26th has this press conference. And then if you look at the 29th and the 30th, on the 29th, they're starting to investigate. It's broader. And actually, one of the things that I've come to understand is that this investigation has more to do with Manning. They're looking for multiple leakers. They're going to try to prosecute anything and anyone that they can get their hands on and try to create evidence on. So on the 29th, you know, the press secretary for the Defense Department says that Army CID is CID, which is their investigative, company, is handling the investigation. The document leak investigation is broader than the Manning case. The Afghan war logs have just been released. And then on the 28th, Gates calls up the FBI and actually brings them in. So up to this point, essentially, the investigation that had been occurring was completely out to lunch, had no idea what was going on, had no idea about the magnitude of the breach. And on the 29th, Manning arrives from Kuwait to the military district of Washington, and the major general of his previous jurisdiction of the court-martial general court-martial convening authority requested the transfer to MDW due to the potential lengthy pretrial confinement because of the complexity of charges and the ongoing investigation. So Manning is now under the military district of Washington. On the same day, Jacob Applebaum is detained at Newark Airport. Okay, and questioned about Assange for 3 hours by agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I go into that. When you click on these, you can actually get more information. And on the same day, the legal standard, a memo was published for the Senate Intelligence Committee at the request of John Dickus on the legal standard for disclosure of cell site information and geolocation information drafted for the Senate Intelligence Committee. So you can see the machinery of the bureaucracy at work. Let's look at what they say to the public versus what they actually say to themselves.
I'm going to remount this home.
So, I'm just making sure I've got this. So here, it's also quite interesting is there's a couple of congressional committees that are really adding fuel to the fire of this investigation and this entire campaign against the culture of disclosure. Some of the more egregious committees are the House Intelligence Permanent Select Committee, and of course the Senate Intelligence Committee, the House and Senate Homeland Security Committees, the drone committees within the House, the Senate Armed Services Committee, a couple of representatives who are belligerent and hostile in their rhetoric, and I think that they should be investigated by the press, are the chair of the House Intelligence Permanent Select Committee, Mike Rogers. I mean, these are things that the press really should be covering, and they're not. Campaign funders, you know, what are their business relationships, and what does that have to do with this particular bureaucratic campaign against whistleblowers? Are you guys following? Okay. So here we are, Senator Nelson of Florida, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Select Committee. He makes a comment that the release of these documents has endangered the lives both of our American servicemen and women and the lives of the Afghan people, et cetera, et cetera. But a couple days later, on the ground from Afghanistan, okay, Captain Anderson, who's in Afghanistan, says, I haven't seen any changes based on that in the information sharing environment. There's really no consequence. The Wikileaks hasn't really brought about anything that he sees on the ground. Are you guys following me? Okay. There's other examples of that. Here we go. Let's look at the Clinton speech vis-a-vis Gates. So, flash forward. There's a bit of an irony to this too. So the Department of Defense releases a press release. It's a news story that they draft, like pretending they're journalists, but it's really actually a press release. You know, quoting Clinton, who is Secretary of State, Clinton saying that these releases put people's lives in danger and they are not, et cetera, et cetera. It's an attack on the international community, this kind of rhetoric, which is basically fueling the press's stories. On the same day, from the same department, Secretary of Defense Gates says here, I'm sorry, it's the next day, that the consequences are fairly modest. So former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in a DoD press briefing, discusses the information sharing environment. And he says that the impact of these releases on our foreign policy, described as a meltdown, as a game changer, etc., are fairly significantly overwrought. Are you following? So it's a complete media campaign. Spin the message. They planning because they have to in order for their democracy to self-preserve, and at the same time, they also don't want to have their own mechanics investigated, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're basically trying to play it both ways. I mean, and they're also, you know, prosecution, what they choose to cite, of course, they're going to choose everything that says that Manning is a traitor and a terrorist, but their own language says two things at the same time. I mean, they're in complete contradiction with themselves. And so that evidence should be brought into his defense. I'm going to give you another example. What he's doing, by the way.
Sorry, you did it out?
1 second. How are you guys doing? Do you have any questions or what do you?
But I think that I heard maybe a while later that somebody was killed. Not correct about that. That was somehow it was related to
There have been no public statements about anybody being killed. The U.S. government hasn't released any evidence that anybody has been harmed for these releases. In fact, the fact of the matter is that the significant acts which comprise both the Sydney, Iraq and the Sydney, Afghanistan databases, their low-level intelligence. I'm going to give you actually I'm going to show you their own language. They'll explain it. Just give me a second here. It's great. I'm going to share this with you. Are you guys So the potential breach is dangerous but not fatal, Lappin says. He's the spokesperson for the Pentagon, noting neither the Iraq nor Afghanistan databases contains intelligence sources and methods. So it's just propaganda coming out of the mainstream media and their laziness as to really investigating what is actually happening, what is the truth, and what is the Pentagon and intelligence bureaucracy's hype around this particular case. And that's their own language. And that's a DOD press release right there. It says it right there. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about before I end. The bottom line is that there's a lot of data in this, and I encourage journalists and legal experts, concerned citizens and activists to look. I've made it a point of trying to source anything that has been redacted, and I'll give you an example. Witness list. So, for example, I went ahead and actually for any of the government witnesses. This is the original witness list for the pretrial hearing. And some of these people were called. Of course, defense was only allowed 2 of its witnesses. But 1 second, please. I'm just going to. So, wherever I can source who it is that they're asking or requiring to depose as a witness or to present as a witness, I put that information in here. That's why I encourage citizens or activists to go ahead and look. I mean, if you have any information or any tips to let me know, if I can cite it, I'll put it into the timeline. We're all using this. If you want to use this in a passive way, certainly go through and read it from the bottom to the top. I think you'll glean your own insight into the case the U.S. government has against these parties. But if you also want to look like some of the things that have been covered, like in November of this year, I found on the DoD website that they have a forecasted contracting opportunity for the FBI for Mantech, Wikileaks software hardware ranging from $1 million to $2 million. And Mantech, a Mantech contractor was the one who claims that he has evidence that he can tie Manning to Assange. So you can also review the case, all the case documentation for the secret orders. In fact, I've also broken them out. Wait a second. DoD, hold on. This is a list of unidentified 2703D, which is basically the secret orders to surveil or to review electronic communications related to the WikiLeaks grand jury. Also on the site for interested parties is a growing list of 1 second, please. Chronology of charges is the agencies themselves that are investigating or prosecuting the parties mentioned. So, for example, I'm going to scroll down to things that are less known. In the Fourth Circuit Court, these individuals, Teresa Buchanan, Liam O'Grady, Ivan Davis, Rouse Jones, and others are basically ruling on matters related to the WikiLeaks grand jury. In terms of the WikiLeaks grand jury also, 1 second please. Neil McBride is of course, the U.S. State Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, so he's the main guy. But there's Tracy McCormick. And what's interesting too is that Tracy McCormick is said to be the lead prosecutor for the WikiLeaks grand jury. She works in DOJ child exploitation. And guess where? Investigating officer for Bradley Manning's military trial works as a civilian employee. The DOJ, which is, of course, he's certainly not impartial. But secondly, he spent most of his career as a prosecutor in child exploitation. Are you guys catching that? I see somebody's face looking quizzical, so I want to just make sure I'm...
I think you may have cut out during part of that.
Okay, so, the defense brought up the lack of impartiality of Manning's investigating officer at his Article 32 pretrial hearing, right? Lieutenant Colonel Paul Almanza, right? You guys got there? He works for the DOJ. He's deputy chief of staff for he's chief of staff for legal policy. Okay, he spent most of his life working in child exploitation as a prosecutor. In fact, since he got his law license, he's worked in child exploitation at the DOJ. The lead prosecutor said to be leading the WikiLeaks grand jury, her name is Tracy McCormick. Okay, she is a child exploitation prosecutor at the DOJ. one person has made, a respected person has made the remark that it might be because the DOJ is so incapable of dealing with digital evidence that they use child exploitation. I mean, clearly, Almanza should have recused himself just by virtue of being a DOJ employee. I mean, he's not impartial. The DOJ has an open investigation into WikiLeaks. There's no possible way that he, in prosecutorial capacity as a DOJ employee, would be impartial towards Manning's defense in his military trial. I mean, it's ridiculous. But there's also John Davis, who subsequently has left the DOJ, and Andrew Peterson, who was hired, as I said, a couple weeks after Manning was arrested. He was hired by the DOJ to handle essentially terrorism and national security cases. So that kind of information is also there for people looking to advocate for Manning, WikiLeaks, and Assange, or for journalists, et cetera, and I'm going to sort of end there.
Alex, can I ask you how long it took you to compile this timeline? It was so detailed and well researched.
It took me about a month. Now, of course, it's far from done. I still have to go through all of the Swedish official documentation. I still have to go through in detail certain elements of the Department of State statements. But it took me about a month. It was a lot of work, and I still have lots more to do. And then, of course, just improving the usability so that people can find, you know, one of the great tragedies of this, but a great opportunity for us as citizens is we have to do this on our own. I mean, we have to investigate these matters on our own. And so I encourage everyone to use it. They don't need to give it any kind of credit. I don't care. To build on it, to correct it, we have to do this together. Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? Any questions? Malika's question. Do you want to go sit here so you can?
I'm a Canadian citizen. Canada, born and raised. So my question is, have we looked at the possibility of the state secrets that the Canadians are hiding from the Americans? Because we're looking at things just from a U.S. perspective right now, and it just so happens that we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which incorporates Canada, the United States, and Mexico. If we're just looking at it strictly from the U.S. perspective, we're not getting the whole picture. And
Right.
the Canadians are hiding a lot of information from the Americans, and as a consequence, the Americans don't have the full picture and are reacting to information that is, the Americans are reactionary, they react to information that's given them. If the Canadians are hiding information, are not telling the truth to Americans, which also includes the British are hiding information, the Canadians are hiding information, the Australians are hiding information, the entire British Empire is hiding information from the Americans. And so the real question is, the WikiLeaks cables and the information needs to be understood not just with respect to what the American cables, American embassy cables, but what are the Canadian embassy cables saying? And why have those cables not been released?
I think, to tell you the truth, I think what you're saying is really, really important. And it's one of the reasons why if I was going to go ahead and do this research, why I wanted to just make it open and available and accessible, is because it can be used in a multiple way. And one of the virtues of scientific journalism, for example, is the fact that it allows people to get the information they need to make the analysis they need, depending on their context, whether they're Canadians or otherwise. I want to share something with you specifically because you mentioned Canada, and I have other resources that I want to empower people to do. Let me share the screen really quickly. Here you see inside the WikiLeaks task force. Do you see this down there? Okay, that's right at the top of the timeline under other resources. Okay, I'm going to just scroll down so you can see it again. So other resources at the top of the timeline. At the bottom says inside the WikiLeaks task force, Canada. Okay, so that's something that I came across a couple of weeks ago. Somebody had actually done FOIA requests on all of the Canada task force stuff, and he has all the legal documentation, and he's gone ahead and put it on the internet. If people are interested in the Swedish case, Justice versus Assange, WL Central, Goran Rudling has a Swedish language site. They go through the timeline. The Nordic News Network goes through the timeline of the Swedish matter. If people also want to take on the mantle and responsibility of investigating these matters, I recommend that they look at Little Sis, which is a crowdsourced networking. Let me give you an example. Obama. You know, it will give you the networks between people. Another, and these are resources that you can input into. So if you find out information about certain connections, you're able to actually contribute to the crowdsourced effort. Another tool that citizen journalists or concerned people can use is theyrule.net. So, for example, I'm going to go to Bank of America, okay? And when I click from Bank of America and I go show directors, it will show all the directors, and then I'm going to show all the boards that they're on. And okay, so these are tools that we need to use as peers to dismantle the current media environment. And to also protect the public from the kind of spin that they're going to get from their governments, etc. And why we have to support Manning and WikiLeaks. Did I answer your question, sort of? I mean, I hope that was agreeable to you. I mean, I hope it gave you something that's useful.
Oh, wait.
You're snoring.
You're snoring. A little bit. I think you know
That the American people to make an honest judgment of what's going on in the world,
How many you got?
there has to be.
How many viewers you got?
We're going to release the
5.
American
So now there was 10.
I got 5 too.
I had 11.
The American people have a right to know. The American people have a right to know, and the Canadians are hiding it. They're sitting in their embassies. The Canadians have an embassy in Washington. I have friends at the Canadian embassy. I know that the Canadians monitor the United States. They write reports back to our government, and they sit down and write reports, and those reports should be leaked as well then. So we know what the Canadians are saying about the Americans secretly, what the Australians are saying about the Americans secretly, what the British are saying about the Americans secretly. The Downing Street memos and so on and so forth gives some kind of an indication of what the British are saying behind the Americans' backs. And the only way that the English-speaking world can understand what's really going on is if everybody comes clean. And unfortunately, the Americans are holding the brunt and are holding the blame entirely, which is not the case. It really is not the case.
I don't see it as that way. I mean, I think people who perhaps have a very simplistic view of, first of all, the U.S. government is not accountable to its own people, number one. I mean, it's just simply not accountable, and that's evidence in the, we're breaking our own laws, right? I mean,
but that's in context, though. In the context of black
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm actually, I'm in full agreement with you. I think that some people perhaps would like to, it's never, process and strategy around conversations is never a straight line. You know, part of the reason why the U.S. is...
I will be right back. Watch Poetry Myself stream. He's still here. I'll be back in like 5 minutes.
Is because it hasn't taken any real accountability for the information that's already out there. Number two is the fact that
Oh my gosh.
Now, is this not a nice break compared to yesterday?
What was yesterday's? I wasn't here yesterday.
Oh yeah, you weren't here yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
It was pizza.
Ordered 2 pizzas, like 5 boxes of pizza, which disappeared in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then they were trying to scramble to get some more food here, so they ended up having to order more pizza, and I guess they had some sandwiches brought over. It was just a lot of food, a lot of people. Or not enough food, a lot of people.
Yeah. Guess not. They put the coffee away. Well, can't. Hey viewers, I know I lost some of you because I came here to get some snacks real quick. I was about to pass out since I didn't sleep, but I am coming back now to speak on Wikipedia. I mean the Wikileaks and.
Because they're reaping all the benefits from that corruption on copyright, on the internet, on everything.
Well, the United States actually is one of the world's greatest proponents against the Chinese and the Indians for violating U.S. copyright and by stealing the trade secrets from Americans. The Japanese steal American trade secrets, the Chinese steal American trade secrets, the Indians steal American trade secrets, and then they run off with the technology, copycat everything the Americans do, rip everything off. And you go to the Middle East, you go to Pakistan, you go to Afghanistan, you go to India, and you buy pirated DVDs and software of all American companies. All the technology is all pirated. And so the United States...
The West has been trying to make money in China since Marco Polo, okay? And they never do, okay? That's just a reality. And it's this kind of outmoded thinking about copyright and patent laws. And I mean, in some regards, certainly we have to protect our interests. No question about that. I mean, I think it would be living in la la land to think that states aren't self-interested, right? At the same time, though, while you're doing that, you need to also elevate the discussion and educate your populace about the challenges that we face today. And we live in a glutted marketplace today. We live in a digital marketplace in many regards along the lines. Property is now the genes in our body, the ideas in our head. Instead of even trying to approach this, I mean, look at what happened with UNESCO. I mean, these idiots, really, self-centered, they don't have the public interest at heart. They're not trying to actually find real solutions to the real challenges. And what they're doing is, we have an 18th century philosophy, 19th century institutions, 20th century outlook, and 21st century problems. And our leadership in this country is driving this nation into the dark ages. You know, we can't Guantanamo our way into prosperity.
Don't you think that we have the opportunity to build prosperity right here in the United States?
I absolutely do. In fact, I trust the idea of self-governance more than the U.S. government does, because I believe that men and women are capable of governing themselves and mastering themselves. And I trust that if they're given the information, if they can make educated guesses and learn from their mistakes and do what they need to do to rule themselves accordingly. The U.S. government doesn't trust democracy. Or let's even appeal to the conservatives. The U.S. government doesn't trust the idea of a democratic republic. Federalist 52. Government's independence derives from its dependence on the people alone. Period. End of sentence. Our independence as a nation, our liberty, right? The independence of government, that ideal that derives from its dependence on the people alone. If you look at all of the, various clauses of the Constitution about foreign influence and this, the fact of the matter is that I think what you're saying is interesting in terms of the fact that how much do the American people themselves, the rank and file, ordinary Americans have, how much control do they have over their government? So I don't disagree. I mean, I'm just adding to the conversation.
Thank you very much. You've made a great contribution. I think it's very, to me, it's as a Canadian, it's very intriguing to hear this perspective, and I think Canadians need to step up to the plate and add to the discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a comment they want to share? We're Alexa. I'm Lotus.
How are you?
Chinese American, so I want to follow up on Molly on Canada. My father was aware that when the Japanese economy was doing, gangbusters, and there was American backlash, racism, racism, right? My father was aware that the Canadian investments and financial interests in the U.S. are much greater and always have been. So at the recent 9/11 Truth Conference here, there's an excellent documentary. It's called, and it's a young Canadian who, started out as a green activist, and he got into the trade secrets. It's called You, Me, and the SPP. And he lays it out in a very easy and non-depressing way to figure out what the interests are. And at the end, you, me, and the SPP. Because the SPP is a bilateral trade agreement between Canadian and American elite financial interests, which gives us the XL Keystone Pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I know the Council of Canadians, they work very hard. They say the Canadian people are being dragged down by the American system, okay? And they're starting to follow the same Homeland Security, military methods. Remember when the G8 was in Quebec City? Okay? The other thing I wanted to point out about India and China is how they're being played in the American press and by Western media. So you have to get information outside of the U.S. And one thing I want to recommend to people is a website from an NGO in China called China-Wire.org, and it gives you enough breadth and depth that you can see China has its own problems, it has its own needs, it doesn't need to be demonized by the U.S. And the last thing is, last night after a day of this conference, I went home and my husband and I watched The International. That movie is Clive Owens. He plays a New York cop who was Interpol and Scotland Yard. And he goes after a huge bank in Luxembourg. So the movie, even though it's got some Western bias in it too, because it paints China as the bad guy selling weapons in Africa, but if you can try not to realize there's still bias in a Western movie, it shows how the big banks make the money, help sell arms, and create and hold the debt. So how else do they keep us economically, financially subjugated, right? We have to pay them. So the International is a good, and we saw it free on whatever we saw it on Netflix, whatever. Okay, so I'll check out your stuff and refer people to it, because if we only look at Julian Assange and Bradley Manning in an American lens, it just keeps Americans confused and scared, right? So there's there's quite a global agenda. So thank you. And you remind me of my friend Annie Garrison, and she's doing the work on Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, and they keep us confused about Congo, because it's not just the coltan that goes into the electronics. They produce the cobalt. Cobalt goes on all the Air Force, all the jet plane propellers, right? So you can't fly, and you can't fly high-speed military. We've got coastal and flown out in the water. U.S. controls. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening, Dave.
I just wanted to remind myself about educating Americans. You know, one of the candidates asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And not the nationalist, I think Bradley Manning, just to tell the truth is doing a whole lot for your country. So